Bum, 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 bum.
You're listening to Tove, a podcast about the good place and Jewish ideas. Hey, this is John Spirasavet, and I'm here again with Dan Ross. Hey, Dan.
Hi, John. Good to be back with you. So excited to talk about episode 6.
You're the first three-timer in the co-hosts, so we've done our introductions before. Hopefully, people have listened to our previous conversations. So I'll ask you this time: is there anything in this rewatch through the series that has caused you just personally to think about something because of the show?
Well, John, in the very first show that we did together, you asked me how I would respond if someone were to come up to me and say, instead of reading the Torah, I would like to watch The Good Place and all the episodes of The Good Place. And I have been thinking now, as I've been rewatching each of these episodes, that, watching The Good Place is kind of like reading through the Torah, like we do every year. You find something new in every episode, just like you find something new in every Torah portion. So thank you for that inspiration. And thank you for inviting me to go back on the journey with our I guess it's 6 friends, right? Through The Good Place. So it's been so much fun.
Yeah, thanks. For me, I've been thinking a lot about this issue of good in the absolute versus good that's relative to me, individually, and the magnitude of large actions versus, particular things that can be done on a given day. That's kind of a general life theme, I think, for myself. And I've definitely been trying to soak in what each of you have been teaching about that over the course of this time.
Mm.
So we are talking about chapter 6, what we owe each other. You want to give the summary?
Sure, I love reading these. Okay, so Eleanor had promised to help Michael figure out what's responsible for the neighborhood's problems. Chidi reminds her of the importance of following through on promises, leading Eleanor to flash back on a promise she broke on Earth to house sit for a friend moving her mother into assisted living and take care of her dog who suffers from kidney problems. Eleanor tries to keep her promise to Michael and also not to tell the truth by distracting Michael with karaoke and other fun but apparently pointless activities. Tahani tries to bond with Jason, who is still pretending to be Jianyu, relying on a magic 8-ball and other tricks to avoid saying anything too revealing about his true identity. Chidi tries to help by accompanying Tahani and Jason to a couple spot to coach him surreptitiously, and it almost goes awry when Jason thinks an impressionist is not a painter, but a comedian who does impressions, instead of a large framed image of Frank Caliendo, who Jason calls the greatest impressionist of all time. Chidi gets him to give Tahani an impressionist-style painting of 3 ballerinas who look like Tahani. Michael calls a meeting to reveal the source of the problems, and just when Eleanor is prepared to face the music, Michael announces that he is the problem and will have to leave them all forever.
Well done. So I know right before we got on, you were showing me your dog, Rashi. And so you're a bit more of a dog person than I am. That would be, I think, an understatement. So there was this whole thing about the dog of the friend on Earth of Eleanor's, who Eleanor was supposed to dog sit. And so I was going to say that, that as I have said before, that they try to make Eleanor's bad parts, not quite so bad that we wouldn't like her. And I was thinking, being cruel to a dog is maybe, less so than being cruel to a person we can actually see. But I'm wondering if that struck you differently, Dan.
So I was trying to remember what happened when that, little flashback was introduced, because my original thought was, oh my God, does this dog die? Like, it's like tease, dog has kidney problems. And then what happens? The friend she's out dog sitting for comes with the dog being carried in a wagon, and it's morbidly obese because all she did was just leave the food out for the dog. And as somebody who has hired many a dog walker in his life to take care of my little fluff Rashi, who is the light of my life, besides my wife Jade. I just recall this one time, like right after we had gotten her, we were leaving her and we had booked a dog walker, and we left treats because we were still training her in like a little, a little plastic bag that the trainer could give to her when she did good things, like, pee outside instead of inside. And it was also going to be dinner time for her. And so we left a bowl with her food in it. But the walker, instead of giving her the bowl with the food for dinner, gave her all of the treats for dinner. And I just remember the poor thing just like completely disrupted. Her tummy was like upset for like, a couple of days after that, because you're not supposed to just eat treats. So, even when you hire someone to take care of your dog, you can't always count on them to do what they're supposed to do.
You are laughing about this, which makes me wonder how seriously you take the issue of cruelty to animals.
Oh, no, I mean, like, listen, she just had treats for dinner. I mean, it's not so bad, right? I mean, but like I said, I think that, you brought up this point about Eleanor being bad, but not like that bad. And like, in this way, it's almost consequentialist, right? Like, I remember thinking like, oh my God, is this dog going to die? Like, I really like Eleanor. I've been rooting for Eleanor. How can I keep rooting for Eleanor? Maybe I just completely forgot this. I watched the show like 2 or 3 years ago. And then thank God the dog doesn't die. I wonder, as a dog lover, if they had killed the dog, if I could ever have watched the show again. I probably couldn't have. I mean, but then again, this show has had a dog kicked into the sun. So.
There you go. I was going to say, so you've survived that. You've made it through that. So that must be good.
Yeah.
I will say that I was the worst substitute dog sitter probably in history. A friend of mine, it was the summer after I graduated high school, was dog sitting and house sitting for someone, and he had to go away, and he knew that I was not a pet person. I've managed to accommodate to dogs now, and he asked me if I would just go in periodically, and I was afraid of the dog, and the dog was afraid of me. It was really, I think food was put out, and I think probably, things happened in places that they weren't supposed to happen in the house, and but I think it was his fault for putting me, leaning on me.
Yeah,
I hope I didn't collect payment for like his share of the payment for that.
Well, you just, you weren't set up to succeed. And I will say, challenge accepted. I promise you that my dog, Rashi, when we have the chance for you to meet her in person, even people who don't like dogs say that she is relatively inoffensive. So
and I think like them, and okay. Certainly conceptually, I like them. I will say,
idea of dogs.
I was very proud of myself about something as I watched this episode, which is that I caught a glitch. I say my wife Lori is a big fan of the IMDb website, where often they have little like errors, whether it's continuity or other things like that. So in the scene where they're out in the neighborhood investigating who could possibly have been involved in some of the glitches in the neighborhood, Janet presents a sheet of paper to Michael with all the people who are part of the cleanup in chapter 2, the garbage cleanup. And I noticed as she was giving him that someone was handing Janet behind like a big ream of paper, like a whole set of you would get out of copy paper. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. And then they cut to the close-up and you get the boop, the Janet boop. And then she said, and here is a list of everybody who was participating in the flying, which was like, reams and reams of paper. And I thought, oh, somebody off screen handed that to her like it was supposed to just appear, and they forgot to cut that part out. And so anyone in my family will tell you that I'm really not that observant about things that are in front of my face. So I would say I am an observant Jew, but I'm not an observant Jew. I did observe that.
Good catch. Good catch. That's a good
anything else kind of on the episode that you really liked?
I thought the scene where they're getting, when they're all in the spa together was pitch perfect, and it almost had like a Cyrano de Bergerac kind of quality about it, like a little bit, where Chidi is trying to give voice to whatever Jason Jonyu is supposed to be doing to impress Tahani. It almost teases like, are Chidi and Tahani gonna be a thing, right? Like so that I thought was really fun.
I'm glad you said. I went right to Cyrano, which I didn't remember from the first watch of this, and back when I first read Cyrano in I think 12th grade, Boy, we seem to be going back to my 12th grade year. I remember reading that, and I thought I am exactly that. I am the smart guy who like girl is never going to want to go out to. But and I don't think I coached my friends by like giving them lines certainly, but I super related on the teenager theme. This idea that when at the end there when my Michael says, "Janet, give me my hoodie," or something like that, and so that he can lie down on the ground and go into his kind of teenage despair, which I thought was really funny just because of how enormous Ted Danson is, and then also just the idea that Janet, like, she would be aware of that he has a hoodie and what he would use it for, and she just kind of looks at him and hands him this hoodie that appears. I thought that was super
The
funny.
slow reveal of Janet's powers throughout each of these episodes, drip, 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 is just consistently a treat. They do a superb job of character development across the board, but as they build her into what she ultimately becomes over the course of these first few episodes and in later seasons, she's just awesome. She's just awesome, the best.
Yeah, and I forgot kind of how long it's taking for her to really show her stuff. I mean, her being Janet and her being Darcy Carden.
Although, again, not a girl. So
Did I say? Did I?
no,
Get that wrong?
I mean, I actually don't know what pronouns we're supposed to use for Janet.
Right.
How often she says not a girl.
This reminds me of actually my niece, Jennifer. Maybe Jennifer's listening to this, who, when she was in grade school, I remember having a conversation. She went to Jewish day school, and she was talking about God on the telephone with me and something she was doing, and referred to God as a he. And I said, I was just curious, why are you referring to God as a he? And she said, well, first of all, everybody talks about God as a he. And I thought, well, that's probably what she's heard. And then she said, God sounds like a boy's name.
Oh my God.
And Janet, sounds like
Yeah.
sounds like a girl's name. So interesting in terms of kind of cultural reference. We have the Magic 8 Ball, and I was wondering if you and I are slightly different generations. Was that part of your youth?
I have one on my desk,
Oh.
although it's red, not black.
Oh.
Pretty sure it was a gift that was given to me when I started at Central for, like, you need to make a tough decision, or you need to know what to say to a congregant. Shake the Magic 8 Ball. All the wisdom is in there.
And I guess if you were posing as a monk, you could theoretically be holding some sort of orb that would sort of fit in with your costume. And but then I love how they generalize it to the. He's just looking for anything at all to say in response to anything, and he comes up with "made in Taiwan," which I think some would say, "Oh, that's correct," or maybe Tahani. That was great. I love the line about frozen yogurt when Eleanor's asking Michael why all the big deal, and says something like, "I love how human beings take something that's perfect and make it just a little bit worse."
Oh my God, that's yes, that was definitely a spot on line. I mean, are you a frozen yogurt fan? I think we talked about this before, but
I partly just for my own health reasons. I used to have a bad habit of eating a lot of ice cream late at night as sort of a bedtime snack, and so it was kind of my frozen yogurt became sort of my methadone. I don't mean to make light of any issues around addiction, certainly at all, but but when possible, I feel like I try to eat frozen yogurt. It's certainly more of what I have around the house than ice cream. So
fair enough.
So it can be quite good. I want to recommend Yasso bars, which they are not a sponsor, but if you're out there, Yasso, you're welcome to sponsor the podcast. How about you?
Oh yeah, I mean, I love a good frozen yogurt. I love the frozen yogurt with the toppings bars, especially, right? Like when I lived in DC, I used to in my building was a frozen yogurt store, and that was like a pretty regular occurrence for me, that I would go and I would fill up a little bucket of frozen yogurt and then put all the hot fudge on it, because the hot fudge you didn't have to pay for. It was after they weighed the frozen yogurt, and so like that's really where it's at. They charge by the weight. Yeah.
I just point out one more thing I loved, which I think there was a reference I might have gotten at some point when they have this whole thing about Friends, the show Friends, that is kind of woven in there. And truth be told, I thought that was a little heavy-handed, but there was some point I thought where Michael was making some reference to Ross and Phoebe, and Eleanor like bumped on that as an interesting, like, of all the friendship. And then I was thinking, well, because, there's, I think and I hope I'm not wrong about this, the six friends and the six characters. But anyway, but then I was thinking, like, in a way, Michael and Eleanor are kind of like Ross and Phoebe if you were going to map these people on. And I thought
Uh,
that might be kind of interesting.
I never watched Friends.
Wow, you're the
I
first person I
know.
think I know.
Yeah, well, just didn't get into it.
Good for
Missed
you.
it.
Good for you bucking the crowd. That's awesome. So I have to say, like, I thought this episode, which I really loved, was kind of philosophically hard to latch onto. I thought the title, "What We Owe Each Other," is tremendously suggestive, but I don't really think that was exactly what the episode was about. I thought it was actually a bit muddled and not having a particular theme, which I think is totally okay, by the way. There are these two ideas of promises and friendship, which are introduced way up top. And I think that there is really a difference between them. The kind of obligations that flow from promises and the obligations that come from friendship aren't the same. I think Chidi was talking at the start about he introduced contractualism, but I think actually they did. This is the one time I think first time they haven't done like a great job explaining why a concept is relevant. I think he was saying like a promise creates some kind of obligation right there. But when Eleanor is trying to figure out how to be a friend to Michael, who kind of in a way sort of entraps her into making that statement, that then she kind of feels like a general obligation, not just because she promised specifically to help him. She said something like, "I am as a person who has audibly promised to help you." That's not how I would think of a friend. So, and friendship has, I'd say, I think has different obligations. I believe that we'll end up dropping this particular episode of our podcast in the period right before Yom Kippur, which makes it really interesting to talk about the idea of promises. On Yom Kippur, we have this prayer of Kol Nidre, where we talk about all the varieties of our, I guess you could say, promises, and we name out categories, and then we actually say that we kind of want out of them, or we want to be released from them. And there are different interpretations as to whether that's talking about the past promises of our year that we know we didn't fulfill, or the ones that we know we're about to. But I thought I would partly read this passage from the Torah, from Deuteronomy, to set this up, which I think creates the general framework. I'll give you this English translation. This is Deuteronomy chapter 23, verses 22 to 24. If you make a vow to Adonai your God, do not delay to complete it, for Adonai your God will seek it from you, and you would have sin in you, I guess, if you didn't do it. When you don't vow, you will not have sin in you. What comes out of your mouth, be careful to do, exactly as you have vowed, as a voluntary offering to Adonai your God, which you have spoken in your mouth. And I think, Judaism has this big set of ideas around the particular words that we say that I remember learning goes really way back to the first chapter of Genesis, where God everything God says happens. There's no gap between God's words and the reality of the world actually being created. I wish I could name the person who first explained that particular concept to me in exactly that way. But I think that might have some reason why vows are so important. And the Torah does talk about like the specific words you say out loud create something that then is like out there and has to be completed.
Well, there's actually a lesson, speaking of explaining something like this. So there's a scholar named Yoram Hazony, who's an Israeli philosopher and Bible scholar who wrote a really great book called The Philosophy of Hebrew Scripture. And one of the things that he talks about in that book is that, to your point, John, the word for thing in Hebrew is the same as the word for word, devar. And so there is no gap between the words that we use and the things that the words that we use describe.
I mean, there's this flashback stuff to Eleanor, who made a promise and very deliberately, clearly didn't do it. It's not clear she had any real intention of doing it. I mean, not even the letter of it. Like, I think the deal was, you got to stay in this house with this dog, feed it, and give it its kidney medicine or whatever, kidney healthy stuff. And she didn't want to do it. And then when she had the chance to go to the Rihanna thing in Vegas, she just left. That seems to come back to her when she thinks about this promise to Michael, that she feels like she made this promise kind of blithely to help him figure out the issue of the neighborhood, to buy time, even though she knows like she can't fulfill her promise without without revealing something about herself. And I thought that was kind of an interesting predicament to put herself in.
Yeah, it brings to brings to mind the question of honesty, how those two relate to each other, honesty and promises and trust. A metaphor that sort of also came up for me that I've heard used a lot in professional development is, I actually had the chance to learn with a coach named Deborah Grayson Regal, who talks about a metaphor of promises and trust is being sort of like a bank that we have. At times we make deposits into the bank when we do things like successfully watch a neighbor's dog or a friend's dog. And then sometimes we need to make withdrawals from the bank for whatever reason, just because we're human. I mean, to be human is to sometimes have to not follow through on our word. So I think that's a useful way sort of to think about how it's inherently transactional, right? Like, in that's how I would problematize it, and that's the critique I would offer. And yet at the same time, it's a useful framework for thinking about how our relationships are informed by the promises that we make to each other.
That is such an interesting metaphor. If I understand what you're saying that a promise in a way is like, it's like borrowing something you don't have.
It's a debt.
It's a debt that you might end up being able to do, right? And some of our loans or investments in us, get repaid off because they succeed and some don't. But then you would be saying like so we have to make the promise in order to create something forward. And that's, I think, what happens with Eleanor here. Like she knows that something about her own destiny. She almost has to make this promise to Michael to help him. If she, I mean, partly for her own self-interest, she assumes if she doesn't, do something to kind of buy some time, then she's doomed for sure. And in this passage in the Torah, it talks about that, don't delay to complete it. Once you put the promise out there, it's then like a thing that has exactly, almost like a debt. You can't say exactly almost. It's like a debt that has to be repaid, or it has a term that perhaps only God knows. I don't know. But that's then what you were, Dan.
Oh, no, the only thing I was just thinking about as well as you were bringing up the time of year when this episode of our podcast will air, that we're about to enter a Shemitah year. And one of the critical...
Tell us.
Yeah, so a Shemitah year is a sabbatical year. And it's a year it's a commandment in the Bible that we should let our land lie fallow, and sort of release ourselves from the notions of control that we have over the natural world. And another important dimension of the Shemitah year is the forgiveness of debts. And so it's almost, to a certain extent, something that our tradition, and coupled with the notion of Kol Nidre, that our tradition takes very seriously, that to be human is to find yourself in a situation where you have a delta between the audibly stated that you're going to do, as Eleanor would put it, and what you actually do. Like that's a hair. But I'm sorry I interrupted your point that you were about to make.
I don't think so. In a way, you're saying there's kind of a balance keeping, as long as you more fulfill promises than less. It may not be that we fulfill all of them.
Yeah, there's a credit score, right? Like,
a credit score.
A credit score. I know that this is what it's come to. Capitalism has finally seeped in to this podcast, Jon. You've already called for a sponsor today. So I mean, it was almost inevitable.
So trying to figure out how to not only see it, I guess, in that way, but the relational way. That's why I think the tension in the episode is between the promise as like a specific thing that in a way is a debt, and then this general feeling. I mean, Eleanor clearly has a feeling that she doesn't want to just kind of occupy Michael and distract him from things, but at least there's this moment where she really wants to help him, even though it might be to her own detriment. And there is the moment, I think it's the moment when he lies down in his, I guess it's not a fetal position, it would be better if it was, but that she has the flashback to kind of when she's confronted with the promise that she didn't keep with the woman and the dog, and she's sitting outside at the cafe or the restaurant, and she has no remorse back in that moment, but here we are, she has this teshuva moment right at that point where she's faced with kind of the same situation. And now she doesn't come out and she doesn't promise to tell him the truth, but she just promises to stay with him. And that's so
Mm,
much more that's so much more general, and in a way not transactional. It doesn't feel
mm,
transactional in that moment.
mm,
But again, I think that like friendship, when we become friends, it's not like making an explicit promise. We don't have. I've talked about this, I think, from my pulpit before, that one of the things that's interesting about friendship is we don't have like a formal ceremony the way we do to consecrate other relationships. You don't go out
mm,
and sign. You don't have a, like in Judaism, a ketubah, like a friendship contract or something. And there's not even necessarily a moment you can point to and say, oh, we're friends now, or we're this kind of friend. It's just, but you know that when it sees it in this general sense, and the obligations we have toward friends kind of vary, like how good a friend. I think actually for a lot of us during the pandemic, it's been this question of, did we come through as the kind of friend towards someone we thought we were, or they thought we were? Did people,
mm.
because we haven't expressed these obligations out loud. Like usually you don't say, oh, now that we're friends, I'm going to be there for you in A, B, C, and D way. And that's why I thought the setup of the episode was a little muddled. Again, it didn't detract from the greatness of the story, but it definitely, I was left kind of in between friendship and promises as a way to organize around this.
That's such a powerful teaching. The delta between the fact that we don't do it, the consecration that you're talking about when we make a friendship. I guess I kind of wonder, what are the basic expectations that are appropriate that we can have of other people? I mean, is that a question that you sort of open up with? I mean, we're not going to be friends with everybody. Friends, it's not like life is not like Facebook, right? Like it's not like just click a button and we're a friend. I don't know.
Yeah, and there are these different varieties of relationship. And I was saying why I thought the episode was misnamed. What we owe each other could mean what we owe people generally, just by virtue. Here are these people thrown together in the good place. Then there's what we owe our friends or the people we have our partners. And then there's kind of what we owe people we make specific promises to, and those aren't all the same thing. And maybe this episode is just about cataloging that. I like in the Yom Kippur prayer, the opening thing actually names categories of explicit things we could say out loud. So, a vow is something that we do, or we say we're going to do, or we're not going to do. There are things that we say, okay, I'm going to stay away from this kind of thing. I'm not going to enjoy this or get any benefit from it. There are things that we say, I'm going to take this thing and dedicate it to a sacred purpose. And there are oaths, meaning that we testify like truthfully that we're going to promise to say what actually happened about something that we saw. And then the Kol Nidre prayer has these other words that are like, if you think there are workarounds to like promise without promising, like we've covered that too. Like if you out loud intend anywhere near them, you have to, if you used any of these words, I have friends who use the term bli neder, without a vow, whenever they promise anything, in order to make sure that they're not violating. It's saying like, this is not a promise, or this is a promise, but it's like, I don't want to be held accountable to it being a promise. And which I
What
think
does
is
that
actually
mean?
no, but I think it's a very powerful way of saying, like, I know, like, I want to be the kind of person who can make promises, but I know that I might fail. So rather than wait till Yom Kippur to have this thing hanging, like the Torah passages don't delay in fulfilling it, I'm just going to say right now that this is in this other category of things I really mean, but I don't want to be held to that standard. So I'm curious, on Yom Kippur, do you have a feeling when you're doing this prayer at the beginning of the day, what it means to say?
It's a classic example of ritual elevating mundane, because precisely as you described it, textually speaking, it's highly contractual, it's highly legalistic, it's meant to close every loophole that we could possibly imagine. And yet the way that we say it, the stakes that we place upon it, with its being the transcendent cantorial moment, musical moment, probably of the entire High Holy Day season, really lifts it up and causes you to see the mundane in a completely different way.
Just saying that even though we might be talking about these formulas of almost legalistic formulas of promise, that we're actually talking about all the kinds of promise
Mhm.
adjacent things that we do.
Yes, exactly. What about you?
I think about how it's meant at the same time to make us take really seriously our words and the words we've said and promised, and to raise them to the stakes of saying, like, we have two choices, which are to fulfill them or to ask very explicitly to be forgiven or released from fulfilling them, and that those are the only choices. Living in that middle place is not good, and that we can't go into a day of such intensity where we're going to talk about forgiveness and actually do a lot of confession. We're going to recite words that are in the traditional liturgy. They're like alphabetical lists of things that we might have collectively done wrong, or I might have collectively done wrong. And in order to say out loud that I regret them, I have to own up to the fact that I know the difference between a promise I've kept and a promise I haven't kept. And that maybe there's a focusing on that. So people will say, well, why are you starting the day by saying, oh, by the way, everything I say is just bullshit. That's a terribly strange, and you're going to do that by taking Torahs out and like hold them and make a special ritual out of it. But that, I think that is the point, not to draw a contrast, but to really remind ourselves that this is serious and that we could clean the slate. I like what you have started off with by saying that. So we're not going to be able to promise that all our promises are going to be kept, but we can promise to recognize the difference between them. We can promise not to be false to ourselves and to others, and I suppose to the divine, about when a promise is something we've followed through on. There is a traditional melody, and I'll link it in the show notes, of this Kol Nidrei prayer on Yom Kippur, often chanted by a cantor, often lately I've heard in kind of like a cello accompaniment or without the words. And I wonder if, I don't know really anything about the source of that music, which is kind of simple but haunting, and whether it's meant to evoke any of these emotions or not. I don't know enough about music, and certainly not about traditional Jewish music.
Haunting is truly the pitch perfect word for it. It's the kind of thing that I think if you just read it, it'd be pretty easy to have your eyes glaze over. But when you hear it sung, and when when that we have a cello, we have a cellist at Central. Great. Yeah. And so, or back in my Hillel days, I would always do everything I could to find some string player, violinist, violist, cellist, et cetera, to make sure that we had that. Because when you hear it in that way, it becomes unforgettable, truly unforgettable.
One of the things I know from the history of this Kol Nidrei prayer is that rabbis, the authoritative rabbis of 1,000-ish years ago, they didn't want it because it seemed really to be a denigration of promises and vows, I guess technically vows, and that it was so important among the people, among the community, that it was one of those prayers and rituals that was insisted on. And almost like the tribal wisdom was that we really do need to talk about our vows and our promises. And I like that a lot, that it sort of overpowers even the like words of the Torah that say you don't have a way out of your vows, or this idea that we're imitating God who does everything. And I just had a light bulb moment, a Janet, which is that Janet is the one who like doesn't have any gap between like an intent and something coming. That if you ask Janet for something, it like appears instantly. There's no gap. I'm just thinking about that right now.
Oh, that's a really good point.
And so I know in later episodes where that'll sort of go awry, any thought Janet has, she'll summon an object when she's glitchy. She gets glitchy, but those things happen too. There's no like thinking about it, and then it comes. And Janet herself, if you summon Janet, she comes in an instant. Thank you, Dan. Again, I think we made something focused out of this episode, which had so many different threads, and great to talk to you again.
Great to talk to you too, and Shana Tova to you, John. Happy New Year, and Happy New Year to all listening, and look forward to seeing you in 5782.
Shana Tova. Have a good year, everyone. And that's another episode of Tov in the books. Thank you for listening. If you're enjoying the podcast, give it a good rating on whatever app you're using and share it so more people can discover us among all the great podcasts out there. You can follow my co-host, Rabbi Dan Ross, and his Judaism-themed fitness videos on Instagram at @RAV_WOD. I'm John Spirasavet, and I've got a blog, rabbijohn.net, and I'm on Twitter @RabbiJS3. We've got show notes with the Jewish texts we discussed here and links to some resources and deeper dives at our website, tovgoodplace.com. T-O-V, good place, all one word. If you've got an idea or a suggestion for the podcast, drop a note to tov@tovgoodplace.com. Again, thanks for including this conversation in your day. To adapt Mark Evan Jackson's sign-off on the official Good Place podcast, now go learn more about something good.
Bum, 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 bum.